It was last year, on my road trip from Madison to Rochester. Most of the roads there are mostly deserted, except for the first and last couple of hours. Everything else is forests or open fields and small mountains once I got further west. Anyway, my plan was to drive all night and most of the day. Instead of driving for 2 whole days and spending money on a hotel. I knew it would still be hard, but I thought it would be worth it. I left home at 6 p.m. I double-checked that everything was packed in the truck and packed snacks and other things in the front seat. Then I hit the road. I spent the first hour driving through towns and small villages, but then the road opened up. There was almost no traffic and nowhere to stop, except for gas stations every 20 miles. By an hour or two, I had only used a third of my tank of gas. But since gas stations were becoming less and less common, I decided to fill up before entering the countryside. It took me 30 minutes before I finally found the right station. There was no one else there, it was just some really small place with 3 pumps. The convenience store was closed. I pulled up and parked next to the gas station, got out and started filling up. I don't know if it was because the place was old, or maybe it hadn't been filled up in a while, but the gas was coming out really slowly, almost a full minute, only 1 gallon. I leaned against my car and just waited. About that time, another car came up the road. The speed limit was 40 miles per hour, but it looked like they were only going 18 or 25 miles per hour, past the gas station first, but then slowed down and backed up. It was weird and honestly a little dangerous on a lonely road like this in the middle of the night. But they backed up to the entrance of the station and parked at the pump right behind me. I figured they just didn't make it to the entrance and really needed to fill up. I continued my fill up when I heard someone get out and walk to their car, but after a minute, when I didn't hear them step on the gas or move at all, I looked back to see what they were doing. The man was wearing a plaid jacket and blue jeans, he was tall and staring at me. When I turned around, he was already looking at me. I smiled awkwardly, then looked away again. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still looking at me. A good 10 seconds passed, and I finally heard him pick up the pump and start filling his car. I stood there for another minute before deciding I had waited long enough and simply pulled the pump out and closed the gas cap. When I did, I saw the man looking at me again. His gaze was so dull and heavy, as if he was tired but had drunk a lot of coffee. I got behind the wheel and pulled back onto the road. Strange guy, I thought, but didn't pay much attention to it. At some point during the next 2 hours of driving, it started to rain. I had been driving for a total of 7 hours and it was already past midnight. The rain made me feel like I had to concentrate on the road, which in turn made the drive even more difficult. I tried opening an energy drink and eating a snack, but it didn't help much. By 1 a.m., I decided to take a break. And I was starting to run out of gas again. I drove down a long, deserted road until I finally saw a gas station to stop at. It looked just as empty as the last one, but the lights were still on and everything. I pulled into the parking lot and filled up the tank, then pulled up to a small building and parked in one of the empty spaces. I checked the weather forecast to see how long it was going to rain for, and looked up any nearby towns, but there weren't any. It looked like I was in the middle of it. I finally decided it would be a good idea to take a 40-minute nap, just to cool off, and hopefully the rain would let up too. I leaned back in my chair and fell asleep. When I woke up, the rain was still pounding the roof, and my alarm hadn't gone off yet. It had only been about 20 minutes. I sat up and looked out the windshield. It was quiet, but there was a car parked at one of the gas stations. I leaned forward and peered closer. It was the same car from the other stop. I was pretty sure of it. Either it was a really incredible coincidence, or something was wrong. What was even stranger was that the guy was nowhere to be seen. Not in his car, not on the street. I felt my heart beat faster. Where the hell was this guy? There was no other place this person could be in this empty gas station. Whatever it was, I didn't want to stay to find out. I started the car and put it in reverse. But when I looked in the rearview mirror as I was backing out, I saw him. Not behind his car. He was sitting in my back seat, piercing me with his eyes in the dark. I darted forward, flinging the door open and jumping out. The car was still in reverse, so it was slowly backing up. I took off running, but I never saw the man get out of the car. I ran towards the store, then watched for a while as my car continued to roll backwards, then suddenly stopped. A second later, he drove away, leaving me at some unknown gas station in the middle of nowhere. That's when I realized my phone was still on the dashboard. I stood in shock for a minute, standing in the rain and realizing the situation. Then I looked at his car. I walked over and found the door unlocked, the keys in the ignition. And by some strange coincidence, I found the phone lying on the passenger seat. It was locked, but I was still able to call 911 from the lock screen. I didn't realize it at the time. I guess I figured whoever stole my car was just stupid and left everything there. But it wasn't their car. The car was stolen, too. Everything in it belonged to someone else, who was treated the same way as me, though from what I heard, they weren't so lucky to be unharmed. When I talked to the cops, they seemed to think that the guy didn't just climb into the back seat and let me drive away. He was probably planning on waiting until we got on the road to give himself away, and who knows why he wanted me as a hostage or what he was planning on doing. He was never found, and neither was my car. It was very recently in early February of this year. I live in a small house in the small village of Stello. The village is about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. I only had a couple of hours of work that day, so I was home early enough. Around 6 p.m., my sister suddenly called me. She asked for help with the car. She needed to replace new brake discs, and for one thing she promised to treat her branded spaghetti. I didn't mind at all and said I'd be right there. I took my jacket out of the closet and my keys, then opened the front door to get out. As soon as I opened the door, my whole body jumped. There was a man standing on the porch in front of me, just a foot from the door. He was wearing a blue coat, and a black scarf was covering the lower part of his face. But the man didn't even move, as if he wasn't as startled as I was. I was immediately curious as to why he was here. Before I could ask, he apologized and said he was just about to knock. I said that everything was fine and asked what he needed. The man was silent for a second, then asked if I was John or George, I don't know, something like that. Whoever it wasn't me. I said no, and the man just apologized and walked off the porch. I went outside, closed and locked the door behind me, making sure that the man walked all the way down my driveway and away from my house before getting into the car. I spent most of my time thinking about this strange encounter on the way to my sister's house. My house was in a secluded area, where it's not often possible to meet random people who just walk into other people's houses, because they are located deep in the woods, with long driveways. If he was just looking for someone else, I think that explains everything. I went to my sister's place, changed the brake discs for new ones quickly enough, and she invited me to dinner, and I stayed with her for about 2 hours before returning home. When I got home, I pulled into the driveway, went to the front door, unlocked it, and went inside. I had a few beers, then jumped on the couch and turned on the TV. After that, I stopped keeping track of the time because I didn't have to work tomorrow, so it wasn't necessary. An hour later, I realized that I was falling asleep and it was time to go to rest. I got up, stretched, turned off the TV and headed for the stairs, but as I passed the front door, I suddenly remembered the guy who was on the street earlier. Up to this point, I had almost forgotten about it. But now that I think about it, I went to the door and looked through the peephole, just to calm down. There was no one on the porch, and the night still seemed quiet. However, a second later, I noticed something moving in the driveway. It wasn't clear, so I had to open the door to get a better look. There were boot prints on the thin layer of snow. They seemed to walk all the way from the road to my car, and then they went deeper into the yard, where the trees blocked my view. I immediately felt very uncomfortable. I closed and locked the door. If it was the same guy as last time and he came back again, then something was seriously wrong. I kept looking back at the windows, trying to figure out what to do next. At that moment, I was so worried that I called the police. I dialed 911 and explained my situation. However, as I was talking, I kept hearing something barely discernible. Every time I stopped and listened, I couldn't hear anything else. About a minute after the bell rang, there was a strong impact on the back wall of the house. I almost dropped the phone, it scared me so much. I hurried into the hallway, hearing another loud bang, and looked down. There was someone at the back door. Because of the reflections of light from inside the house, contrasting with the darkness outside, I could not see anything except a slight movement outside the door. Another thud hit her. It was heavy. They definitely had some kind of weapon or something to break down the door. The operator advised me to either find a place to hide and lock myself in, or find a way to escape. I decided to grab my keys and run to my car. Even though I knew that this man was behind my house, I was still afraid to run out into the open, but I had to act. I couldn't stay in the house. Fortunately, I was able to leave. And it was the right decision, because when the police arrived at the scene, the lock of the back door was knocked out, and wet shoe prints were visible all over the house. But there was no one inside. All I could tell the police was a description of the man who was on my doorstep. But there was no actual evidence that it was the same person. So even if they had found him, it wouldn't have done much good anyway. But they never did. Whether it was him or not, I think I was lucky that I bumped into him when I was leaving the house. If that wasn't the case, I wouldn't have checked the door before going to bed. If I was already asleep, maybe they would have been more careful with hacking. I do not know, but what makes me most nervous is that all this happened on a very ordinary day. There was no way to know that something like this could happen any day. While he's still out there, sometimes I feel like I'm just waiting for it to happen again. I'm 25 years old, and last year in July, I moved into a place to live by myself for the first time. It was an apartment with 5 units in the building. This apartment was the cheapest of every available place for rent on the market at the time. I had a full-time job, but I didn't make much and I really rushed myself to move out of my parents' house before I was actually ready. On the day I moved in, I set up a futon couch in the living space and hung up my small TV, and that was pretty much it. I didn't have anything else aside from the basics, and I didn't have the money to buy more stuff. The futon was my bed for the time being, so I slept out in the open. On that first night, though, I was woken up at 5 a.m. to someone knocking at my door. I looked over at the door, not wanting to get up, but once they knocked again, I realized they weren't going to leave. There was an older man, mid-55s I'd say, standing outside my unit. He was just looking at the door, waiting for me to answer, and seeming to have no intent on leaving. I opened up and asked what he was here for. I wanted to introduce myself. I live in the unit, 1 door down, he said, pointing to the door at the end of the hall. I smiled and said thanks and all that, then told him I was busy and had to get back. I closed the door and went back to my couch. I had the next 3 days off from work, and all I wanted to do was sleep in and enjoy my new apartment alone. I fell back asleep, not waking up until midday. After showering, I grabbed my keys and headed down to my car to pick up some food. As I was backing out of my parking space, I saw someone watching me from a window. They looked away once I looked at them, which made me uncomfortable. I counted the windows up to the 3rd story, which was the same floor as mine, and knowing that there were 2 units per floor, that had to be the same man who'd come by that morning. It left me with a weird feeling, but I pulled out and left to get food. When I got back to my apartment, I ate while watching TV and spent the rest of the day on the couch. I stayed up until 10, when my eyes started getting heavy. I turned off all the lights and laid down on the futon, but something caught my attention. There was this red light coming from somewhere in the kitchen. It wasn't too bright or anything, but it was blinking on and off, which became an annoyance for me. I got up and went into the kitchen, thinking it was going to be the dishwasher or microwave, but neither of them had lights. As I was looking at every appliance, the light blinked off and stayed off. I was so tired I didn't even think about it until the morning. With all the lights on now, I did another quick search, and to my surprise, I found something. There was this small thing wedged between my refrigerator and the wall. I moved the fridge and pulled it out. It was a camera. A really tiny one, but it was 100% a camera of some kind. I stood there looking at it for a couple minutes, until someone knocked on my door. I checked, and it was that same older man from the other day. I opened the door cautiously. The man said he was seeing how I was, but he sounded and looked nervous. He had a strange smile and just seemed off. He took a step closer to the door, and I said I was fine, but was busy again today. He didn't respond after that, but instead just stood there with a strange and awkward look. I felt anticipation, like he was going to do something. He quickly shoved himself toward the door, trying to get inside. Luckily, I was stronger and pushed the door into him, keeping him out and eventually shutting the door all the way and locking it. I called the cops, and within 15 minutes the guy was in handcuffs. When I showed the cops the camera I found, he admitted it was him without even fighting it. But after a further investigation, they found cameras in 3 other units. I think by admitting to the one in my unit, he thought they would trust him and not feel the need to investigate the other units. I know it was just some sick creep who probably wouldn't have done me any real harm, but it gave me the weirdest, most unnerving feeling I'd ever had.